Well, I guess while we're getting set up here, any questions you guys have been pondering over the weeks? Emerged. No?
The speed of light.
Yeah. Anything about it?
So you said that things are happening faster than the universe is expanding?
No, I said the speed of light seems like it's a limiting factor on anything happening faster than the speed of light. Right? So it seems like nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. And this is sort of a strange, almost arbitrarily seeming number that everything in the universe is bound to follow. But why is that there? Why can't anything seem to go faster? And so I said, that's the kind of thing that some people point to as evidence of a simulated universe, because it's the kind of thing you see all over the place in simulated universes. Just numbers that say nothing can happen faster than this, because if it were to, the whole system breaks down. We're not prepared for it. So it's just the sort of thing, again, it's not like an ironclad scientific proof of anything, but it's the sort of thing that has that sort of echo, that mirroring of simulated universe that makes us think like, huh, that's interesting, you know? Yeah. All right. Well, okay, while I go, okay. I was thinking first and foremost, one thing we could start with is just a couple of the objections people sometimes raise to some of the proofs we looked at in the classes previous. And so the first one I was going to look at is, this is by Immanuel Kant, who is a philosopher of old. Thank you. And he had this idea of sort of this universalized morality. Universalized morality. So basically, so Immanuel Kant was not a Christian, although he had some pretty interesting ideas about God, especially he believed that beauty had an objective source, right? So that there was some standard of beauty by which we evaluate everything. And we sort of saw with the ontological argument, anything we can show that there is some universal, absolute, purest source of it, really starts to lead people to God. There's actually a Catholic bishop in California. His name is Bishop Robert Barron, who does a lot of this kind of apologetic stuff. And he said, more people come to him saying, I decided to become a Christian because of beauty than anything else, he said. Because they're sort of struck by this idea of just, beauty in our world, or, and just while we're on the subject, I remember, how obviously the church partners with Camp Quanos. I remember one Sunday, one of the leaders came to kind of give a short testimony at the church on Sunday morning, and she said one of her young girl campers who was not a Christian woke up. They decided instead of sleeping in their cabin, they're going to sleep kind of near the lake, right? So they slept there, and this girl woke up early, couldn't sleep. So woke up early and just sort of sat on the pier and watched the sunrise. And when her leader woke up, she told her, said, I think your God made this. Because there was something about the beauty of it really struck her. Even though, she again didn't believe in God, but something was just so profound about it that she couldn't really explain. So there's, according to some philosophers like Immanuel Kant or say Bishop Robert Barron, there is something about the idea of beauty that really strikes people. But that's aside. So he had this idea of universalized morality. He was trying to show that the argument from morality that we went over before is not valid. You don't need God to understand morality. And this is sort of how he said it. So he proceeded by what we call proof by contradiction, which means you assume the thing you want to show is wrong, essentially is true, show how that leads to a contradiction and say, well, there you go. It led to a contradiction. The thing I assumed can't be true. So this is commonly done in math and logic and things. So he said, so he wants to show that it's not okay for us to steal, right? That's sort of his example. So he'll assume it is okay for us to steal. Okay, so again, this is proof by contradiction. He wants to show this is false. It is okay for me to steal. Let's assume this is true. And to show how it leads to a contradiction. I'm going to leave some room, so I'm going to add some more fun symbolic notation. And then he said, well, if it's okay for me to steal, then it must be okay for everyone to steal. And I think this has some intuitive, sort of power. Unless we consider ourselves to have the divine right of kings, we probably think if a law applies to me, it probably applies to everyone. So he said, okay, right. So if this is true, then it is okay for everyone to steal. one to steal. And then he said, but look, this is absurd. We know it's not okay for everyone to steal. That's a very sweet remark. We know it is not okay for everyone to steal. Then 4, it is not okay for me to steal. Me to steal. And then he has arrived at the contradiction he was looking for. As soon as it's okay for me to steal, was able to conclude it's not okay for me to steal. Contradiction, proof complete. He said, therefore, we see that it's not okay for me to steal. And you can basically replace steal with anything, murder, lie, cheat, embezzle, whatever it is. And you're going to follow the same process, sort of universalizing it and then negating it here. Okay, before I sort of dismantle this here, any questions about the basic premise? Oh, pretty much okay. So, I mentioned a couple times, we can analyze statements that people make using propositional logic, right, which is a branch of mathematics all about analyzing proposition statements, right? And we come to understand what they're saying. So in propositional logic, what this is saying is, again, pardon a lot of symbols here. I'll explain in a second, but there exists, backward E, an X such that steal of X. Okay, so let me explain some of this here. So E of X, it doesn't really mean, all it means is E is backwards E means exist. So there exists an X. Okay, an X at what? Well, that's what this is. S of X, S can be anything, doesn't really matter. S of X, it's okay. So X can steal. Okay. So in propositional logic, that's just how you would break it down. There exists an X such that X can steal. And in this case, X is me. That's right. There exists a person such that that person is allowed to steal. And that person is me in this statement. Then 2, it's okay for everyone to steal. This would look very similar. Okay, for all, upside down A, all X, S of X. So I'll explain that over here. So upside down A is just for all. Okay. Now, right off the bat, we have a problem because this just broke a rule of logic. Okay, you cannot go from there exists an example of something to conclude that everything follows that example. Right? For example, very easy. There exists a person that is a man, therefore everybody is a man. Okay, no, right? And obviously you can see this pick any example. I'm sure you can think of 1,000. You cannot go from knowing one thing that exists to conclude everything is like that, right? That's just a pretty obvious rule of logic that he broke. Okay, so right off the bat, we see that this is going to come up a lot of times in this class. Our intuition about something has misled us. Right, so because we sort of said, intuitively it kind of makes sense. Okay, it's okay for someone to steal. Okay, for everyone, there's some intuitive understanding, but we see it actually breaks the rules of logic. So now he just claims we know it's not okay. Well, why? Right? There's no justification for this one. He just claims it. We know it's not okay for everyone to steal. Now again, intuitively this kind of makes sense because it's kind of how society is structured and kind of how we feel in our heart. But again, I think last class I mentioned the idea of, the video game Grand Theft Auto. Imagine this simulated reality. Imagine all the characters came to say, we've all collectively decided it's not okay for us to steal. Well, the designer of the game could say to them, you are wrong. I don't care what you collectively decided. You are wrong because you didn't make the rules. You didn't make the universe. You don't know what I know. You are wrong. And so again, by what authority is Immanuel Kant just asserting that we all know it's not okay for everyone to steal, right? Again, this is just appealing to cultural norm, cultural convention, okay? What we kind of wish is true, but this is not, you cannot make this kind of claim without having an understanding of sort of how reality is knit together, right? And again, this is of course very apparent if we consider universe, to be simulated or these sorts of things. But even beyond that, right, it's just a very bold claim that has no evidentiary support, right? He cannot actually show why this is true. He's just appealing to, human nature or human desire. We all desire this to be true. So this is just illogical. You can't jump there.
Ryan,
yes.
Sorry, so I just trying to digest that. That's kind of what I was thinking at the beginning of this argument was, so number 3, right? We know it is not okay, but the question came to mind is how do we know that it's not okay?
Right.
Is that what you're getting at?
Essentially, yes, exactly it. Where's the laptop? I can advance the slide. And this will come up a lot, right? And again, this is actually what we're going to find this whole class this morning is all about is the limits of knowability, of what we can know. Because oftentimes you'll see that the objections to a lot of what we're talking about really just come down to some sort of sense of like, we just know that this is true. And again, as I've sort of mentioned a couple times, it's surprising in a way because this is sort of the criticism leveled at the Christian or a faithful person, right? That they just have blind faith in something and they just say, well, I believe just because I feel like believing. But what we'll find actually is the objections to all the things we're going to are really just, well, we just know that's true. And you'll remember another example about when I was talking about the fine tuning of the universe. Richard Dawkins said, well, sure, we know the universe looks fine-tuned, but we know it's not. And, right, no argument given, just we know it's not, the end, right? Because there's not really anything tangible they can appeal to. So it's just like, it's just hand-wavy, well, we just know it. So now what this is, interestingly, is, so this would be, it's not okay. Oops, Marcus dying on me here. I don't happen to know where more markers are kept. This is, remember the symbol in logic is not okay. Yeah. It's not okay for everyone to steal. And then again, what he said was, it's not okay for me to steal. So then it's basically saying, this would something be like, there exists an act such that it's not okay for another. So now, depending on how he describes this, again, there could be another possible error again in here, because if he says, it's not okay for everyone to steal, it still does not follow that it's not okay for me to steal, because it could be true that it's not okay collectively for everyone to steal, but that there could be exceptions if you look at any individual case. And again, I think this doesn't even, he tried to appeal to some sense of like, well, this is how society works, this is how ideal society should operate. But in fact, we already know this isn't even true of what we want our governments to be, or our society to be. I'll give you an example. In World War II, Allied codebreakers stole secrets from the Nazis. Was that wrong or right? I don't know. It seems like it's probably okay, right? But now we have another problem here, because now you cannot universalize morality, because now there are exceptions to it, right? And so again, it's like, this is not, morality in this sense is not universalized. It's like, well, most of the time it probably is okay, we shouldn't steal, but on a case-by-case basis, we'll analyze, depending what the circumstances of the world are and what the course of history is at this moment. Again, this is not a absolute. This is a cultural convention, a norm, what's useful and convenient at this moment in time, right? So again, this is not, when we talk about absolute morality, absolute truth, this is so far from these ideas that they'll try to construct that it's quite silly, right, to try to universalize something when we have immediate counterexamples that we show is that's just not how we even want society to operate, right? Like we want usually, I say, right, our government to be able to make these kinds of decisions to, for example, bring down a Nazi regime, right? Like we basically want society to have that capacity. And if we were to universalize morality, we would not be able to achieve that. So I think, when it comes to either logical errors, just outright stating things, the counterexamples from our own society, these kind of ideas just start to fall apart very quickly. Any questions about then the universalized morality? All good. Okay. So that was this one. Let's look at the counter-objection. So you remember Leibniz's cosmological argument was somewhat of a unique form of an argument for the existence of God, in that it was primarily concerned with the explanations of things, right? What is the reason something is the way it is? Thank you. Okay, we'll just go through and some of these are. Okay, that should work fine. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Put that here. Okay, right. So Leibniz was concerned, what is the reason things are the way they are, right? And so to roughly summarize what he said, would say something like, just all contingent things have an explanation.
I apologize, Ryan, because I'm the new guy here.
Mhm.
Is there a quick way, if there isn't, I'll look it up at home. What does contingent mean in this?
Oh, sorry. Contingent means something that
Just like
it is true but could be false.
Okay.
This is by contrast to necessary, which must have existed, must be true, and could never have been otherwise.
Gotcha.
Right. So like basically everything we can even fathom is contingent, right? It exists now, but it could have failed to exist. There was a time when it didn't exist, and probably a time when it will cease to exist. So all contingent things have an explanation. And essentially, roughly stated, I mean, God is the necessary explanation of that. And this is a very, very coarse summary of the real proof, but I need some room on the board here. Plus, I don't want to reiterate the whole thing. Next explanation of that. Okay. So roughly stated, right? So we need to explain how things came about. The beginning of the universe, let's say, explains why all the things we see are here. But then what explains that? And whatever explains that cannot be contingent, because that would, again, require some explanation. It must be necessary. And so we say that, like Aquinas, this thing we call God. Okay? But now the objection would be, okay, so God is the necessary explanation of the universe. Is the fact that God made the universe necessary or contingent? Right? Did God necessarily make the universe, or did he contingently make it? Okay. Because if God necessarily made the universe, as in he inexorably did it, he essentially had no choice over it, he must have made it, well then the universe is not contingent at all, right? Then the universe would be necessary. We're all necessary. Everything we do and say is all necessary, right? It's not contingent. It must have happened because God must have made the universe. Well, this is very, very odd and sort of defeats the original purpose or premise, I should say, that we're all contingent to begin with, right? So if God necessarily made the universe, he had no choice. He must have made it. I mean, the whole argument kind of breaks down because there are no contingent things actually, and everything is necessary, right? So this is a problem for us. Okay. So problem. So okay, well let's imagine the other branch of this thing then. Did God contingently make the universe? Okay, well let's imagine if God contingently made the universe, then what explains God's contingent decision? Because as we said, all contingent things have an explanation. So what explains God's contingent decision to make the universe? And what the sort of objector in this objection would say is, it actually can't be anything because we have no more contingent things. So that's sort of what we said. There's all these contingent things here. God explains all that. There's nothing left. There's no more contingent things. So this, essentially we would become sort of this infinite loop, basically. So this is the problem for us. So then the objector may say, well, look, this proof doesn't make any sense because once you get down to it, if God is the necessary explanation of the universe, is choice necessary contingent? Either we run into an issue of either nothing is contingent, or we sort of run into this recursive case where we have to keep explaining God's explanations of things. And I think what the objector is perhaps failing to consider here is that God is not a force. God is a free will having agent, right? And this is something, again, we don't take on assumption. We demonstrated this many times throughout the course so far. So if God is a free will having agent, then the explanation of his contingent decision to create the universe is that he has free will. And not only does he have free will, but as we showed in C.S. Lewis's argument from reason, he is the source of will, of free will. So if God, being essentially the sole being capable of making a distinction between necessary and contingent choice, because as the only necessary being, right? We cannot choose to have things exist necessarily because we are not necessary ourselves. And the source of reason himself, then it seems to me that God, as a free will having agent, is able to use the power of his will to contingently decide how the universe should come about, though he himself is a necessary being. And so I think this comes up actually quite a bit, this idea, because again, people sometimes have this, so I'll give you an example. I was talking with my brother-in-law over Christmas. He's very strong, very passionate about his atheist beliefs, okay? And one thing he said to me was, I have no problem with the idea of a God that made the universe and walked away, never to be seen again. He doesn't like a God that is sort of present. And why? Well, because essentially, a God that makes the universe and walks away, never to be seen again, is actually kind of essentially no different than a force, right? It's a mindless force that did something and then sort of fades into the background, right? But people sort of like the idea of God as force because, again, it removes it creates a scapegoat for people to levy accusations against God. And this will come up, I think, in class 6. We look at sort of God's quote unquote sins, right? Of why God said things in the Bible or did things in the Bible. Because I think they're looking at God as this mindless force. At the beginning of the world, for example, decreed at the moment of creation, like, thou shalt not eat pork, and then walked away forever. And people are like, that's really weird. Why would you say that, God? Right? But of course, we don't conceive of God as a force that says, thou shalt not eat pork, and walks away, right? When we have a full context about it, we understand that God's interaction with humanity provided that instruction for a moment in time that had a symbolic purpose, fulfilled in Jesus, amongst sort of perhaps other dietary guidelines at the time. But the point is, God is not some mindless force that interacted with the world in one moment and thereafter just never intended or was capable of interacting with people, right? But I think some people do conceive of God like this because it gives them a bit of an out, right? And so if you conceive of God as just that force, then you could come to understand that this would be a problem if you don't perceive God to have will.
Isn't that more like deism?
It may be a version of deism, though deism is quite broad in that, as far as I understand with deism, there are branches that say, Christianity could be true because sort of Christianity would almost be sort of a subset of deism in that, some God exists, right? Well, they're not necessarily saying it's not the God of Christianity. It's just that they don't have enough information to make that final judgment. So, example of this would be the philosopher Antony Flew, who was a very, very, very famous philosopher atheist for decades, traveled the world debating Christians, okay? And then right near the end of his life, he's passed away now, somewhat recently. Near the end of his life, he said he's converting to deism, right? And the reason was not even philosophical because he was a philosopher. It was actually because of scientific reason, like the fine-tuning argument. He said, there must be some creator God. It's the only thing that makes sense. But he wasn't ready to say, but it's Christianity. But he also didn't rule it out. But certainly, yes, there would be forms of deism that would say, yes, there's a God, and yes, he just walked away, and that was the end of it.
How is that different from being agnostic?
Agnostic just say there's no way to know one way or the other if there's a God or there's not. Deism say there is a God. We just don't know anything about it, or can't make any final conclusion.
Or if I understand it correctly, it's the God. It's like you said, a God who created the universe but then walks away and has no involvement.
Mm-hmm. That is definitely a form of deism for sure, right? Because again, deism sort of encompasses any possible creator God. Mm-hmm. One branch certainly being God that just walks away, right? But at bottom, they sort of acknowledge the universe requires some creator being, willful agent to make it, and then after that, the details get a bit fuzzy. Right. So, but I think yes, through the 10 arguments we had over the last 2 classes, I think we can show that God is not just a mindless force, right? He has a will and is a source of reason. And so if you think of that in your head, then this is not a problem at all, because God, by his free will power, can make any universe he wants at whatever time he wants. And that's sort of how I would answer this.
So are you saying that this is not true? The other day you said God isn't necessary.
Right. So,
Right?
so basically, what I've sort of shown on the board here is how someone objecting to Leibniz's cosmological argument would show that it's a problem. Sort of like how Immanuel Kant. This is how I would argue against what you're saying. So they would say, if God is an explanation of the universe, then did he necessarily create the universe or contingently, and both ways lead to a problem, therefore your argument is flawed. That's what they say. And what I would say is, no, this isn't a problem at all, because God has the free will capacity to make any universe he wants at any time he wants. Okay. All right. Ooh, that's not right. Very well. Put them back. Was this meant to be a whiteboard marker?
It's in there, I don't know.
Yeah.
Go, Kevin.
It's not the shark. It's not the shark, but it even has an eraser built in. It's just, not really meant for it. Okay. So now let's take. So now we're going to start looking a little bit more closely at the Bible. And so if you sort of followed the path we've gone through the course so far, right? The idea is like, okay, we've taken nothing on assumption. We're analyzing the world. We've come to see through 10 arguments, just by examining reality, there must be, again, we'll say there must be a force that is omnipotent, omniscient, that has free will, has reason, the source of reason, is self-existent, has the capacity to sort of, interact and engage with the universe, right? And again, by Aquinas, this thing we call God, right? So we're not assuming God has these qualities. We're examining reality and coming to understand we need a being to exist with these qualities, okay? But now, sort of if anyone were to kind of follow us that far, the objector, the skeptic, has a bit of a problem, because now they don't have much room now to sort of wiggle out of the conclusion of needing God. But one thing they'll say, though, is, so now they'll maybe start poking holes at the Bible itself, right? And just say, there's a problem with the Bible, therefore they have a problem with God. And this actually, if you look at this on YouTube, all kinds of these videos, they call them sort of like deconstruction videos or deconversion videos, people who were Christian at a point in time and now decided, they don't believe anymore. And literally I've heard this like kind of conversation verbatim many times. It'll go, I was like the worship leader in my church for like 30 years. And before that, I was like, the kids' youth pastor and everything. I was in my church. So it's a person in like their 40s or whatever. And then, one day I decided, what, I'm going to read the Bible. So this is, a person who essentially served in the church 30 years, never read the Bible, okay? Like, I didn't read the Bible. And then, can you believe it? When I read the Bible has slavery. Did you know that? And then the other person, wow, really? Yeah, it has slavery. And I realized I can't be a Christian after that. The Bible has slavery. So I was out. Okay. So right off the bat, someone who is, purported to be a Christian for 40 years and served, probably should read the Bible at some point in time. But nevertheless, I think what this shows us also is a flawed, again, form of logic leading them to an erroneous conclusion. So basically what they're saying is this, right? They're saying the Bible is wrong. Okay, essentially the truth of the Bible is wrong, and therefore there is no God. Okay, essentially, what they're saying. Because one thing you'll notice in these deconversion videos is they don't go, I realized the Bible is slavery, and that was a big problem for me. But obviously, by many, many arguments, there still is a God. And so then I went on a search for which God could it be, and that's why now I'm a Sikh, right, or a Muslim. I've never seen a video like that. What they always conclude is, the Bible has some problem I don't like, therefore there is no God, and I don't believe in anything. I'm an atheist now, right? So that's what they're saying. The Bible has a problem with it. It said there's slavery, whatever it is, and therefore there's no God. But if you'll remember, in our sort of, according to the rules of logic, if you have something that looks like this, something implies something else, if you flip it and also change the sort of negation, it's logically equivalent, right? So that would be logically equivalent to if God exists, then the Bible is true. And again, just to reiterate the example I used from previous weeks, it's something like, if we're in the Ridge Church building, then we're in Maple Ridge. And if you flip it and change the not, it would be if we're not in Maple Ridge, then we're not in the Ridge Church building.
You could reverse it too, right? Like you could say if the Bible is true, then God exists, correct? Instead of GB, just go BG.
So you're saying like you could say from this, you could transform this to if the Bible is
Not
true.
number two, yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah.
From this, you cannot get to that, actually.
No, but number two though, right? Could you go like BG?
No, you couldn't.
No, okay.
And yeah, so this is actually sort of a huge problem you'll find that people make in logic, because they'll basically assume you can do things like that in logic, and you can't. But this leads to other problems, because we'll see from this. Okay, so they're saying the Bible's wrong, and therefore there's no God. And this is logically equivalent to saying if God exists, then the Bible's true. But this is just absurd. If any God exists, the Bible's true? Of course not, right? It could be the God, again, of Islam, or one of the many gods of Hinduism, or whatever, right? So what they've essentially done, right, is they've used an error of logic to just explain away the fact that they don't have an intellectual reason for abandoning their faith. They just don't want to be a Christian anymore, right? But, sort of relying on a, flaw of logic to get there, I think it's quite intellectually, sort of disingenuous. And so the problem, in a sense, is what we would all say, and I think even the skeptic would agree, right, that this is the real form of it. If the Bible is true, then there is a God. Well, that's obvious to everybody, because the Bible says there's a God. So if the Bible's true, then there must be a God. And again, if you flip it, the law of contrapositive is called, then if no God exists, then certainly the Bible's false. That is correct. That is
That's
correct.
what I was thinking.
Sure. But the problem basically is the most common one is people, what they'll do is they'll just see something like this, and they'll just toss not in front of it and think that's the same, right? So if the Bible's true, then God exists. That's obvious. And they'll say, well, because I don't believe in the Bible, then therefore God doesn't exist. And that's how they sort of create this one up here, by just performing that sort of not in front of it. But you can't do that, right? That is not a valid transformation in logic. So again, they've sort of broken the laws of logic in order to just explain away their position. And this is, in my opinion, this is really common. You'll see this kind of thing where they're basically just toss the not in front of it. So what we see, right, is, but I think presumably maybe you'd even know some people like this. Or I'll give you another similar example. A friend of mine, his parents were Christian. They were attending some church, I can't remember where, and they were getting divorced. And so the church said to the father, the husband, hey, you're getting divorced. We think you shouldn't participate in the children's ministry anymore. Okay. Now, whether the church was right or wrong is sort of beside the point. You can decide for yourself whether they should or should not have said that. The point is, then this guy said, well, I don't believe in God then, right? Because basically, someone said something mean to me, therefore God doesn't exist, right? Which again is really quite logical absurdity, and also imagine weighing this in your mind. Okay, God exists. He's the necessary being that created everything. Also, because he said he was Christian. Also, Jesus, I believe Jesus died for my sins. But someone said something mean to me. Well, that trumps that one. That's way more important. I mean, so it's logically incoherent and really just quite absurd, right? But again, I think you'll see these kinds of things all over the place. If you just go to YouTube and look, Google deconstruction video, you'll find more examples than you could ever watch in your lifetime. But I've watched several of them, and never have I found any actual compelling reason. It's always these sort of twists of logic to get them there. And I mentioned another one a couple times, right, where the guy traveled to Uganda, saw suffering, and said, okay, there's no God, right? Which again is not any kind of reason for the existence of God. Maybe only the attributes of God, perhaps. Okay, so but yeah, this one basically comes up a lot in my opinion. People just don't like the Bible, therefore they conclude there's no God, and don't really consider that like any other religion, right? Because they're only trying to deny Christianity. And actually, there's sort of another thing on that. If you ever notice, in my experience, if you look at debates, religious debates between people of faith and atheists, typically, I don't think I've ever seen another example. The atheists will be debating Christians. Why? Because it's disproving the Bible that they want. That's the one they need to defeat. Because the other ones are just sort of, for them, not really in the running. Because in their mind, at least, right, if the Bible is not true, then there's no God, and they win, and they're off scot-free, right? So I think that's also quite interesting. Okay, so now let's talk about the limits of knowability. So whenever I teach this part, I mean to bring a prop, a funnel, and I had it at the door, and I forgot to bring it. I had it right beside me. Don't forget it. Okay. Limits of knowability. So here's the thing. When we look at the world, our perspective is sort of like a funnel, okay? So you have to imagine I brought the prop. It's like a funnel. All this stuff is coming in, right? And we're sort of distilling it in our worldview. But the problem is that at the bottom, there's a hole because things are leaking out. And what I mean by that is there are things that we can't explain that are coming in, information coming in that we can't explain in our worldview, right? There's a limit. There's a hole where some things are leaking out. And so, we saw this, for example, with Descartes, right? He was saying, like, I think, therefore I am, but basically anything beyond that, who knows, right? There could be something interfering with our ability to understand the world in terms of perceptual information, right? And again, I mentioned the example, like I have glasses. If I take my glasses off, I have a problem perceiving the world. Something is interfering with my ability to perceive the world. And what Descartes said was like, this actually affects all of us. We all have some limitation on what we can know if we're only coming to understand that by what we can perceive. Okay, so there's a limit. I mentioned the, again, atheist evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein, who basically said, like, it's funny how some scientists claim, I do my work with no faith, that's it. And what he would say to them is like, you don't know, you're not a brain in the jar. And people are just, piping in information to see what you think. Because if that's true, you can't do science. You can only do whatever information is being piped into your jar, right? And again, this is sort of like the movie The Matrix, right? It came out a long time ago, so I'm going to spoil it for you. If you've not seen the movie The Matrix, this character, Neo, thinks something's wrong, right? So again, some intuition, something's wrong, something's unexplained. And he, of course, through a series of events, realizes that actually he's just a person in a pod. Everyone is a person in a pod, and that all of reality is just a computer simulation that robots have done to keep humans in slavery. Okay. And somewhat crucial sort of point is that the character Morpheus tells him, you cannot be told what the Matrix is. You need to see it. And like, this is, I guess, done for dramatic purpose. He could have actually told him. I mean, I guess the purpose is you probably wouldn't believe it, right? But the point is, Neo had to get outside the system to see things for what they are. And again, right, this, I think, really comports with everything we've been saying so far, right? Gödel's Incompleteness theorem, right? Within any system, there are things that are true that you cannot prove within the rules of that system. Like the Matrix movie, you need to get outside the system to see things for how they are, to plug those holes in reality. And so, we look at it from, again, Descartes' philosophical ideas, Brett Weinstein's analysis of science, or even Albert Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible, right? So, so philosophers run up against this. Scientists run up against this because at bottom, how do scientists even understand the ability that they can comprehend the world? We take it for granted that we can just do experiments and understand things. But at bottom, scientists are very confused by this. Or we look at it from the angle of mathematics. Gödel saying there are things we cannot prove. So there are limits of what we can know. And again, we saw this with Immanuel Kant's objection from morality. If we only rely on intuition to plug that hole, we're in big trouble. Right? But I think this is how most people do actually plug the hole. They just sort of, this is kind of how I feel, and by the way, live your own truth, so I'm right. Okay, this kind of thing. But we see this that really causes problems. And again, I've mentioned it many times. I love this phrase, but right, again, C.S. Lewis calls it essentially chronological snobbery, right? That, okay, we're all examining reality, and there's some things we don't know about morality and this and that. But I think if you ask most people, I think, have some sense that they have kind of got it figured out, right? I think some people might just be like, yeah, I have no idea. But some people kind of figured out, like, I know what's right and wrong, and I've kind of got a handle on it. I know what's right. Okay. But again, right, this really, I think, exposes the limits of sort of this intuition of just coming to understand something. Because, as I mentioned, again, we look back on people 100,000 years ago and think, oh, people were savage barbarians, didn't know anything, right? Despite the fact I've mentioned, like, many amazing scientists. But they're like, they didn't know, they were, bleeding people. Or I just read the other day, during the plague, doctors said, don't bathe in warm water because it'll open the pores and let the virus in. Okay. So people are like, oh, those fools, they didn't know anything. And so they apply this sort of idea of like, well, they didn't know everything we know about science to basically mean, well, they don't know what we know about morality then and truth. Okay. So because they were lacking in some scientific knowledge, they didn't get morality right. So if they said, for example, homosexual marriage is wrong, well, they're fools. They also believe that you could put a leech on you, right? So they equate these things that aren't really equatable. But again, right, I think if for anyone who does believe this, they've got a big problem, because 100 years from now, people will look back at our sort of scientific understanding and think we were crazy. I don't know what it's going to be, but presumably something, right? Oh, those savages, they were burning oil and destroying the environment. Wow, who would do that? Whatever. But again, and then they are going to do the same thing. They're going to equate. And those mortal savages, they thought something was right. Well, they also burned oil, or again, whatever it is, right? They're equating these things. So if you rely on your intuition to plug the gaps in your knowledge, you're going to sort of be committing this chronological snobbery and opening yourself up to 100 years from now, people thinking that you're a savage, right? Because you're only relying on your information that you're able to gain from this moment in time, this culture, this space, right? So really, whether we look at it from, again, philosophy, math, science, sort of just, moral history, if you want to call it, right? It's going to fall apart every time. And we need something, like in the movie Matrix, outside the system to fill in the gaps. Tell us, what is what? To answer the questions that we cannot answer by examining reality, right? So with examining reality, we can come to understand a lot of things, but things like morality are not one of them. So we need something from outside the system. Well, this, I would say, is the purpose of the Bible, right? The Bible is sort of this artifact from outside the system, as it were, that is telling us things that we cannot understand for ourselves, or come to understand by just observation, right? God is telling us things about morality that we cannot come to understand, about purpose, about our relationship with the creator of the universe, which again is outside the system. We can never sort of understand that from within the system. About, how we should comport ourselves, how we should live our life, how our relationship should be like with others. Because again, even if we try our best to come up with this relational understanding by like Immanuel Kant, we fail, right? So this is the purpose of the Bible. It is something from outside the system, plugging the holes in our reality. And again, so for example, of why I think this distinction is important. I've had, if you can believe it, multiple people tell me, say this to me. If the Bible's true, why doesn't it list every animal? Right? Multiple people have raised this as their like main objection to the Bible. It doesn't list every animal that exists. Which, first of all, is kind of bizarre because obviously, species come and go in a sense. I don't know how it could ever do that in a timeless way. But again, the Bible is not a zoology textbook. It's not. That's the purpose of it. It's not to list every animal. We have the ability to go discover animals, right? So the answer of what animals exist is not a question that needs an answer from outside the system, right? We could discover that. And again, it's funny, talking again with my brother-in-law over Christmas. He has a very high-minded idea of science, although he's not a scientist. He's like a car salesman. But anyway, or something like that, right? So, but he has a very high mind of science.
So are some scientists.
Yeah, well, that's true also, but but he sort of has science, on the pedestal and appeals to it. Even though he didn't go to university for it, but I'm not trying to insult him, but I'm just saying, like, some people have very bold claims about things when they don't necessarily, have any backing for it. But anyway, so he said, it's the greatest human pursuit is to uncover knowledge. Right? This is the greatest thing. We can go and uncover knowledge. And yet, in this almost same breath, he criticized the Bible for not explaining all knowledge and all quantum mechanics, for example. And I said, well, that would then be a disservice. If God told you everything in the Bible that you needed to know about the reality, that would defeat what you just said was the primary purpose of humans, to go explore and find knowledge. So this God that you're saying should have given us all this knowledge is exactly opposite to what you've identified as sort of the beauty of humanity, of going to understand things. So again, I think this shows that the purpose of the Bible is not to tell us things that we could already find out, right? It's to tell us things that we can't find out, ever. Again, about God, about morality, about our purpose, about, relationship with God and with each other. And so in that context, we see that the Bible, or something like it, is actually necessary for us to understand reality, right? So again, we're looking around, we say, okay, we did 2 classes, 10 arguments of the existence of God. Okay, I guess God exists. Now what do? I'm stuck. How do I find out about this God? Okay, well, there are, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever, books that purport to be a message from God. Well, maybe I should start to analyze them because I need something, right? Or I guess there's also the possibility of in this deist idea that God made the universe and I can never find the answers. Okay, so if you want to be a defeatist kind of attitude, you could just give up. But presumably, if you want to find the answers, just looking at reality is not enough. You're going to have to see, which, if any, of these sort of messages from outside the system are true, right? And so in this context, we need the Bible. It is necessary for us to understand reality. Now, we're going to have a couple classes of analyzing the Bible from a number of different ways in terms of sort of historicity, historical accuracy, the objections people make to it, about slavery, this and that, and also comparing it to other religions. That's all coming. But I think what I hope we can maybe see is that it's not enough to just say, I want to know the truth, and therefore I will simply examine, physics. If you really want to know the truth of reality, you require information from outside the system. And the Bible is at least sort of claiming to be that thing, right? Here are the answers from outside the system that you cannot determine. And sort of let me explain them to you. Any questions about the Bible as sort of this plug in the hole of the limits of our knowledge?
What are your most significant examples that you have found?
For like the Bible plugging that hole?
What's the biggest hole that's been plugged?
I mean, morality, I think, is a huge one, right? Because again, we've sort of looked at the example from Immanuel Kant. We cannot come to understand morality for this universalized philosophical idea. We looked at the example from the objections to the arguments for morality from the naturalist, and also from the type of, so I mentioned, that one was, one example, Richard Dawkins saying like, well, eugenics works, but we shouldn't do it. Well, no. In a purely naturalist worldview, if eugenics works, we should do it, right? But of course, he says it because he doesn't want the fallout of what people would, come to understand what he's saying. Or people saying, well, I do believe in morality, but I just don't believe in God, and showing then they'd have to show how naturalistically it could emerge. So there's sort of, I guess 3 examples, Kant, the naturalist idea or eugenics, where trying to kind of, cram ideas of morality into some box that we control just fails. We cannot explain it. So the Bible tells us, like, hey, guess what? I've got the answer. Here it is. This is how morality, this is how you ought to behave. And essentially, this is also why you ought to behave that way. Because I am God and I make the rules, essentially, and I know what's best, which is a fairly reductive way of saying it, but kind of boils down to that. But another way, too, would be, another big hole is, okay, if God exists, then who is this God? Because we cannot really come to understand the nature of God by just examining the outcome of this reality. So who is this God then? What are his attributes? Who am I in relation to this God? Okay, how ought I behave in this relationship? If I wanted to, say, draw near to this being, is there a method by which I can do that? And so, then we find, obviously Christ's, death on the cross. Sure, yeah. For the forgiveness of sins, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of very big questions that I'd say are answered by the Bible.
Another good one would be love, right?
Yes, right.
Because there's a lot of people that can't understand that.
Yeah.
It's such a huge part of our life.
Yeah, actually, so here's another sort of good example of that. Actually, there's sort of 2, it's sort of related. Back in 2001 or something like that, early 2000s, there was a band called Live, remember them? And they're not a Christian band, but they released a song called Heaven. If you remember this one. And basically the lyrics is, you don't need to tell me about God and truth. I look at my daughter and I believe. Right? So I don't think that the band was Christian or maybe became Christian, but there's something about, it seemed like, at least in the lyrics of the song, this person having a child, and somehow, yes, that love struck them in a way that was more profound than anything that, people could tell. They say, you don't need to tell me. I look at my daughter and I believe. Or another example, I can't remember her name. There was, again, a very prominent atheist biologist who, again, sort of argued against, Christians and things for a long time. And she gave birth, I can't remember son or daughter, but gave birth, was sitting in the hospital room looking at her child and said in her mind, she sort of knew this being is nothing but a random collection of cells. But she said, I can't believe that. right? Again, something profound struck her about love. And he said, so then we say, well, why are we thinking this? Why, the sunset and the daughter and the love, why are these things striking us? The Bible says, I have the answer to that. Right? So again, it plugs that hole, right? So there's all these, I think, quite profound, in some ways, I'd say like the most profound answers, right, about our reality are, being plugged by the Bible.
That was like, I remember we were talking about, I forget the guy's name, but there was that neuroscientist I was referring to. There was a neuroscientist way back when. He was one of the pioneers of the field, and he would, open somebody up, and he would stimulate parts of the brain, and I found this very interesting. Like he could stimulate somebody's finger to move, or like, electrical, like, what's the word I'm looking for? You get fuzzy, right? But the one thing he was never able to do was stimulate imagination or free will. Like that never happened when he would stimulate parts of the brain. So the whole idea is like, where does that come from?
Yeah. Right? Yeah. So exactly, the Bible does sort of plug these holes for us. And I think, if we look to it, if we have a wrong perspective on it, we may get ourselves into trouble because, if we look for it to like have a list all the animals or whatever, we're going to run into some weird issues. But if we look at it as fundamentally as plugging these holes in our knowledge that we could not understand, I think it really starts to make sense. And again, like I think what my brother-in-law said is actually quite true. It is actually a gift from God to us that we can understand our reality. Right? God gave us minds to use them. I think I mentioned in the first class, right? This is, in my opinion, almost like a form of worship of God, to plumb the depths of our reality, to appreciate the majesty of creation, what God has made. I think this is sort of a form of worship, using these minds God has given us. So that's all, very wonderful. But sometimes there will come some limits that we require. Again, just like, I like the Matrix. I think it's a good analogy. I'm going outside the system to see, how things are. Any other questions about that then? The Bible plugging holes. All good? Okay. So now we have an argument where people, so they'll kind of follow this far again and say, okay, you're saying that we require the Bible and that God exists, and that's all, well and good. But what all you say is true. We need the Bible. Well, the God in the Bible is evil, and I would never worship this God. He's capricious and commits genocide and all these sorts of things, right? And again, I was talking with a friend of mine, and again, I went through all these arguments with him and just sort of backing him up into a corner intellectually. And so he said two things, right, that I think are somewhat shocking. Number one, that he said, well, I don't think I have free will, and so I can't agree with you even if I wanted to. Which again, I think we've sort of shown that's a fairly silly and untenable position, I think. But then also he said, well, God is evil, and so maybe on like my deathbed, I'll be like, okay, God, whatever kind of thing. But I would never worship God. But I think this is actually kind of interesting because what he basically said essentially was, because he had no more arguments for that God didn't exist. So he basically was like, well, fine, maybe God exists, I guess, but I just never worshiped him. But now this is sort of kind of interesting, right? Because he's no more arguing that God doesn't exist, just that he doesn't like the God that exists. But this is kind of weird, right? Because if God exists, okay, so we're saying God exists. That's essentially the person has followed you that far. They're saying, okay, fine, God exists, but what I read in the Bible, I don't like it, so therefore I don't believe this God. But now, I mean, again, we sort of mentioned this question, I've said many times, what are the cosmological implications of your objection? So you say, okay, fine, God is evil, but you've already acknowledged God exists. So at this point, it seems a bit silly to say, well, okay, God exists. He made the universe. He made everything. And yet, when it comes to whatever this is, let's say, again, slavery is often one of slavery. I know what's right. God, you may have made everything, and you made the laws of physics and the universe, and you're a necessary being, and you're omnipotent and all that. Sure. But I know the answer to this one. You got it wrong, God. Like, this is a bit weird, right? That we would presume that God is capable of making the whole universe, and yet made a mistake when it came to, let's say, what's right. Again, imagine playing soccer, and the ball comes and you slap it down, and the referee, blows the whistle. Hey, handball, you can't do that. You're like, well, I know. Who you tell me what the rules are? I know the rule, right? No, in no other context would we, use the argument, that the creator of the rule has made an error, and we know the rules better. Okay. But let's think about this even further. Let's imagine, so he said there is a God. That's what the person has come to agree, right? That God exists, I still like. Okay, so God exists. Well, what if God is like Loki, the Norse god of trickery? Okay. So if that's true, if God is Loki, then slavery and murder and mayhem is awesome. Because that's why God, Loki, being God in this case, made the universe. To do these horrible things, right? And so we ask ourselves, like, again, what is, because you're saying, well, slavery is bad and God is saying it's good, which again is not what's in the Bible. We're going to come to that, but that's the objective. Slavery is bad, God says it's good, therefore God is wrong, I know it's good. But really, I mean, what is the definition of good and bad in this context? Because there's only one of two options. One is essentially good is just what's emblematic of God, which I think is actually, that is sort of the correct definition. Good is what's emblematic of God. Or I think what the person is sort of saying is sort of good is just sort of this utilitarian idea of like sort of what's good for the many is good for the few kind of thing. Which I think, that sort of falls apart too, right? Because utilitarianism does not really answer the question of what's right or wrong. Again, it's just what's useful now. Okay. And so again, if God is Loki and likes trickery and mayhem and murder, then for us to say that Loki or God is wrong and that we are right, again, kind of going back to that Grand Theft Auto example of stealing. No, you just don't understand the rules. You've made a mistake. The designer made the design this way, and you just made an error, right? So if God exists, God gets to choose the rules, right? And it doesn't really matter whether we like it or not. It just is what it is. And so, I mean, in some ways, this is sort of like a little bit of an unpalatable answer. People don't really want that answer, right? They want to understand sort of why the context of the Bible is as it is, and we're going to go into that. But I'd say, so the intellectually complete answer is, even if God said genocide is awesome and murder and mayhem is fantastic, I guess that's what's good then, right? Because God exists, so God gets to make the rules. And again, at most, you could say, right, like I said, okay, well, I don't like the Bible then. That does not seem to comport with reality. Therefore, I like, the Quran, okay, or something like that. That at least is something. But again, I have never seen anyone say that, right? They just say, I don't like the Bible, or God is evil, the end, I'm an atheist, I don't like it, right? Which again, I think is intellectually dishonest. If God exists, he gets to make the rules. Why? Well, like I said, why, in our limited understanding of time and space in this moment, would we even presume to understand it better than people, again, 100 years ago, or 100 years in the future, or God? Again, chronological snobbery. So it doesn't make any sense that people would object to it in that way. But again, even if God is evil, then our understanding of what's good and evil is just wrong then, right? Because God made the universe, he gets to make the rules. And we may not like it, right? Like, I wish I could make the rules, right? We all kind of want to be in control, but not liking it doesn't change reality. Again, just like if you play soccer, you're bound by the rules of soccer. If you don't like it, pick a different sport, I guess, right? Of course, in our reality, we can't pick another dimension, because as we saw by the ontological argument, God is God there too anyway, right? So we cannot escape it. So just not liking it doesn't really matter. So there's sort of, again, the intellectual approach to this is sort of the more contextualized, sort of, personal, relational approach. The intellectual approach is, if God is evil, essentially, so what, right? God made the rules, that's it, right? Which again, I don't think people really like to hear that. But to some degree, I think is sort of the correct answer, right? God made the universe, God makes the rules. Who are you to say otherwise? Now, again, we're going to go into sort of contextual analysis of the Bible in a couple classes. So that's coming. So if the intellectual one bothers you, the other side is coming. But any questions or ideas about that, just this idea that like, it's not enough to just say, well, maybe God exists, but he's evil, therefore I don't follow him. That the God's existence sort of gives us all we need to show that we must essentially follow him or be self-deluded.
Well, it just sounds like that whole thing of, why does he allow suffering in the world?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, if he loves us, why does he allow that?
Yeah.
That whole thing, right?
Yeah. And, one thing I'll point out too is, so that guy I mentioned who went to Uganda, saw suffering, and decided not to be a Christian anymore. The interesting thing is people in Uganda by and large, aren't saying that, right? People in Uganda generally are, relative to, say, here, quite faithful people, actually, and quite, religious people. So they don't look at their own suffering and conclude there's no God. So it's, again, it's a little bit strange that someone, again, would come there and be like, we see something, they're suffering, and conclude there's no God, when the people actually suffering are not concluding that, by and large. I'm sure some do. I'm not trying to get universal, right? But statistically, demographically speaking, they're not coming to that conclusion. So again, it's very strange that someone would do that. But again, as I mentioned, it doesn't, suffering in any place does not tell us that God, billions of years ago or whatever, didn't make the universe. All it maybe has a question is, there's suffering in Uganda. I wonder what God's plans are. I wonder who this God is, right? That's an actual question we could ask. We cannot ask, there's, again, no God, because we have so many arguments that show it that didn't talk about suffering, or our arguments were not predicated on, okay, you see in this premise here, we assume this only works if suffering doesn't occur. Yeah, that was not in there. So the argument of like, well, I see suffering is just does not in any way diminish our argument for the existence of God. Anything else that was? Oh yes. And so what this is sort of all coming to is the idea that some truth must be revealed. And again, right, sort of in this philosophical sense of, okay, Morpheus saying, you cannot be told, you have to sort of see it, you have to exit the system. But really, this is actually something we understand quite intuitively, right? For anyone that's, ever known another human being, okay, whether it's a spouse or a child or a friend or whatever, a coworker, right? There are things you can come to understand about them by observing them. Okay, you kind of think, they like eating that food, or whatever, right? They laughed at that kind of joke. Interesting. Okay. But some things about that person, you'll have to ask them why they think the way they think, what they like about this, what they think about that, right? Stalking them will only get you so far. Okay, some truth must be revealed, or any kind of work of creation. You go to an art gallery, you see a painting, and maybe you're moved by it. And you might think, I think the artist was going for this kind of idea. But if you want to know, you have to ask the artist. Or like me, I make video game world. Someone may play the game and understand something about me, something about what I was trying to achieve. But if they really want to know, they have to ask me. Right? Some truth cannot be discovered; it must be revealed. And we see this again in our world reality requirements of the Bible. But this is very natural, I think, and intuitive to us, because this is how we approach most things in life, right? Our relationship with people, again, or any works of art or whatever that we enjoy. We can understand something about their intent, something about them from the creation. But we must ask the Creator. We must ask the person to reveal truth to us to really get a full picture, right? So again, this idea that we should require the Bible shouldn't even be that far flung of an idea, because we encounter this in every other aspect of our life almost, where we require truth to be revealed to us so we can understand people or creations or things. So the same thing is true of our reality, same thing is true about God. And then so to say again, intuition is flawed, right? We've seen again through Immanuel Kant's sort of universalized morality, or this idea that now in this time I understand what's right. I've kind of come to understand it. People in the past were fools. People in the future, they don't really think about, because I don't know, they don't want to imagine that people in the future will be smarter than us, I guess. Right? This idea that we've somehow intuited morality and truth, we've sort of shown time and time again that this is just very, very flawed, but is largely what you'll get in terms of some of these arguments, because people, it's sort of what I mentioned about that, that book Tactics, right? Someone says, well, this is what I think. You say, oh, how did you come to understand that? And usually they won't really have a rigorous answer. They'll just well, that's just what I feel, or something to that effect, right? So it's this intuition they're relying on. But again, these ideas are really at odds, right? Because this idea that, again, so we're saying, okay, here are the reasons why we believe, right? These are the reasons we have faith. To counter the idea that, again, Christians have blind faith. But of course, the objection is just like, well, why don't you believe in God? Well, that's just what I feel, or something to that effect, right? So we see that the tables have kind of turned, in a sense, right? We've shown how, through this analysis, Christians or people of faith are not merely blindly having faith. We have very, very, very good reason. And so when we turn the tables on sort of the objector, we see that a lot of their arguments kind of boil down to logical errors or just sort of intuition. And it's sort of, I mentioned before, if you come across a very compelling argument, please tell me, because I would love to find it. I have tried. I've watched all these YouTube videos searching for some compelling argument that I can sort of think about. And I like thinking about this stuff. I want to find compelling arguments to think about. I cannot find them. Again, like I sort of mentioned, the most compelling arguments are there's suffering. Again, I believe in evolution, which, you know, this is moot, has nothing to do with it, and so on and so forth. So the sort of intuitive ideas of God are just, yeah, very, very flawed. Well, that's basically what we have for today. So again, if you sort of followed the roadmap, we've sort of shown how, you know, faith is not blind faith, right? Faith is not irrational, but it is like very rational if you approach it from philosophy, mathematics, science, that we have 10 arguments for the existence of God, and that once you come to understand that, you'll see we have holes in reality. We require some information from outside the system due to our limits of knowability, and that is why we need the Bible. And so coming to understand that, next class we'll look at, okay, we need the Bible, but is the Bible even historically reliable in the sense that, you know, so just as a bit of a preview, Mormons and Muslims both say essentially the Bible is true, except that it's been corrupted so much that what you think the Bible's saying, it didn't actually say, right? So you can't, you know, Christians cannot even understand what the Bible is saying because it's been so corrupted. There's just no coherent understanding of what it was ever intended to say. Okay, so you don't even know what the Bible claims the objector would go, right? So you can't tell me whether it's true or false because you don't even know what it's trying to say. Okay, so that's going to be the first thing we look at next class. That we do know, in fact, what the Bible is trying to say. We can analyze. That's coming next class. Any sort of final questions, thoughts here before we wrap up? Good.
Well, one
Oh, yeah.
Just curious, when you talk about disclaiming evolution, growing up, you're taught about like the Big Bang Theory and the dinosaurs and tectonic plate. Like, how do you kind of address that piece?
Well, I mean, essentially, I mean, those things could all be true or false or some, you know, version in between, but they have nothing to say about did God create the universe or not, right? And that's sort of the piece that fundamentally we're really interested in, right? So
I think that's what it's saying, right? It's evolution.
Well, but here's the thing, right? So why would evolution or the movement of tectonic plates on this planet have anything to say about what happened billions of years before, right? It's too late. So how evolution occurred on this planet has nothing to say about how the planet got here, right? And that's the key of it.
Well, the latest, of course, is the multiverse.
Sure.
Right? Like, so, you know, they go on, like you said, about the Big Bang, you know, oh, well, the Big Bang happened. It just happened, right? But they don't talk about creation, of where did it come from? So then what some of these scientists have done is, of course, they go on about the multiverse. And of course, you think like Doctor Strange and all that. That movie's fantastic. By the way. But no, like they use the multiverse as a cop out.
Yeah.
This is for those scientists who are not Christian or religious in any manner, because what they're kind of nudging and winking, in my opinion, is, well, if you have these infinite number of multiverses, there's a statistical likelihood or probability, well, we're just going to have a universe where we're in it.
Yeah.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But then, of course, you can go even bigger. You can go like, where'd the multiverse come from?
Yeah.
Like, it just never ends.
Right. And so, on that, I mentioned, I think, was the last class, or maybe the class before, there's a book by, Sir Roger Penrose called Faith, Fantasy, and Fashion in the New Physics of the Universe, who basically just shows, like, that is such folly. And again, he's not a Christian, right? So he shows how it's crazy. But again, again, talking about my brother-in-law for Christmas. He said, well, I don't believe in God. I believe, in a multidimensional, metaphysical, quantum possibility space, right? But again, I would say, like Aquinas said, and this thing we call God, right? The capacity for some force being to have this multidimensional metaphysical quality is exactly basically what we're saying is God, right? So as I sort of mentioned, a rose by any other name smells sweet. I say God, you say multidimensional, ultimately physical quantum possibility space, same thing. But about that, about evolution, like, I just don't even like, I think it's a real big rabbit hole, sort of red flag or red herring or whatever. It doesn't address the issue because you could talk forever about the mechanism of how evolution happened on this planet and, how cells coalesced and how the earth cooled and this and that and geographical things and tectonic plates. But really that is just missing the point, which is how did that planet get here? How did anything get here? Or sort of the classic, the biggest philosophical question that there is, right? People ask, why does anything exist, right? This is the question. Why is there anything? Not why does how did people evolve on this planet, right? So I think all of those objections are really missing the point. So I don't even like getting into it. Evolution exists, it's true, it's false. I like punctuated equilibrium, you like this, version of it. It's all such just irrelevance. Because again, what does it have to say about the beginning of the universe? Why anything exists? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing to say about that. Does that clarify a little bit?
Kind of, yes, kind of no.
Yeah.
But then, like, if you say, okay, well, God created the earth, and then on day 3, like, then you've got Adam and Eve. Like, if you're following that timeline, how does it fall in with your explanation, then, right? Because then there's this big gap of all these other things that say it happened. So.
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways, and there are many Christians who are equally convinced of one way or another. So I don't think there's any solid. But one thing. Okay, so obviously some Christians do believe that those are literal days, and the Earth is whatever 6,000 years old. Those are literal days, and this is possible. God could do exactly that if He wanted to. On this day, boom, there's people, and there's the kind of game designer in me kind of like that. It's just creation, I like that. It's kind of cool, But then of course the sort of mathematician in me kind of likes this idea that God very intricately set up the conditions and just kind of let it go, That's kind of cool. You can sort of see how this grand master plan emerged over billions. That's cool. So, and then some people Christians might say, well, in the Bible it also says that to God a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So that's day 1, day 2. Who knows what time period has gone on between those? So I think there's a lot of things that people could mention there, but I think one thing is very crucial to me is what human was there to observe that? No one, right? So the words that God gave Moses is historically the person we say wrote Genesis. The words God gave Moses were intentional, right? God said, write down this. Okay, well, why did God say that? Well, perhaps that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's because people ask, is the Bible literally true or is it figuratively true? And in fact, I would actually say that it's actually truer than literally true. And what I mean by that is for example, when we read in the Bible that God so loved the world, a lot of us probably know that in Greek, it doesn't say the word love. What is, the word? It says agape, right? Greek has 4 words for love, and we have 1. It's God so agape the world. It's this self-sacrificial love, this pure love, versus sort of this eros, which is a romantic love, phileo, which is how we get philanthropy, brotherly love. There's one more thing I'm forgetting, right? But in Greek, now the Greek Bible is maybe more literally true than the English Bible because it has more power in the words, right? Or just take another funny example. If you've ever read the book 1984 by George Orwell, they're purposely taking words out of the language to remove people's expressive ability. So now, if someone were to write a Bible in the world of 1984 in their newspeak, would that still be true? Well, it would be true, but it's true aside from the fact that the words lack expressive ability. So when someone says day 1, day 2, our language actually is incapable of capturing the truth of God, right? I think we can understand this somewhat, again, intuitively in the idea that how could our language really capture this universe outside of our reality? It can't. It has to approximate. So God is telling Moses, okay, look, this is going to be the best approximation for people to sort of understand the purpose of what I want to tell you, the meaning of what I want to tell you. So write it down this way. And so I think it's sort of an error to look at it either literalistically or figuratively. We should rather look at it and say, what is really God's purpose in communicating to us? Another example is, did a flood really happen or not? Some people say yes, some say no. But my perspective is, the flood either happened exactly as it's described, or that idea that it did happen is so packed with important truth that we may as well treat it as it's true. Right, so if you're familiar with, there's a Canadian psychologist, Jordan Peterson, if you ever, he's sort of popular these days. And one thing he says too, he's not a Christian. He's kind of, I don't know.
Oh, he's not? I thought he was.
It's hard to tell sometimes,
Yeah.
But usually he says he's not a Christian. But anyway, but what he says is the stories of the Old Testament are so packed with truth that you should essentially believe them, because the truth that they're communicating is so powerful and profound and fundamental that to deny it because it's not historical is missing the point, because it's true whether it historically happened or not, right? In this very pure, powerful form of truth. So what I would just say to people is like, with the flood happened or not, it's either true or it's so profoundly, purposefully, meaningfully true in a sense that you may as well just assume it actually happened, because it seems like God is basically telling you to think it happened for some reason. And I would maybe contrast this with, Jesus says, some of his parables are clearly not true. They're not meant to be true. And we see that very clearly. So there is a distinction being made in the Bible between things that are presented as factual. Again, whether they're historical or not, I think is actually missing the point. And things like Jesus saying, like a story.
Well, I would argue I think, what did you say? You said it's not literally true, but there's truth, right? I think that's what you said.
Essentially, like because
just why I'm saying that is because, like, and you also said, and it's true, like our language is limited in the way we can describe God, and so therefore, God, he would speak in parables or allegory as well as literal truth.
Yes.
You know what I mean? He has to do both.
Yeah.
So I would argue the Bible is both.
Well, I think it's both, but I think it's actually more. Like, I think those ideas are too limited.
Yeah.
Right? That yes, our language, I said, is not enough to capture God. So asking if it's literally true, it's still missing how true it is. And God is more true than that. So yes, I just say for anyone, who is curious about the days or this or that, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had. But I think we should be careful in trying to interpret the text in ways that maybe is not necessarily the point, and that that there is some limitation in our ability to even just write down what God wanted to say, because his truth is sort of transcends our ability in our words. Does that help at all?
I think the language has a big factor, because as a child, I didn't grow up reading or writing English. So even these days, I have a 60-year-old granddaughter that sometimes corrects me, and I'll say, "Oh, is that how you pronounce that word?" Right?
Yeah.
Well, I think when I started looking at the Bible, each word has a different meaning, right?
Yeah. So I think that's right. So looking at it in sort of wanting it to be literally true, I think it is actually missing the full truth of God. Because again, you'd ask, well, what language is it literally true in then? And could our language even capture God's full intent? Yeah, very good. Okay, well, we are coming up on the service is starting soon, so why don't we pray and we can finish up here. That's okay. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, God, once again for this time we can come together and understand you and the logical underpinnings of our faith. And I thank you, God, that you gave us the Bible, God. You're not sort of this God of deism who created the universe and walked away, God, but you have love for your creation, for your people, and you gave us the Bible in a way for us to understand reality, understand you, understand how we can, receive salvation in Jesus' name, God. And you didn't leave us to our own devices, but you revealed yourself, you revealed truth to us. So I thank you so much for that. I thank you for every person here today, and that you would continue to reveal truth, to their minds, to their hearts, God, reveal yourself to them, and that this would, benefit their own personal faith, and then also anyone they come into contact with, God, that they would have words to share, to encourage and help others along as well. So we thank you, pray for your continued blessing over the class and everyone who attends. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, thank you guys so much. See you next week for the historical reliability of the Bible.